Alara Whitmore woke to the sound of glass breaking somewhere below her window, and her heart slammed against her ribs before her eyes even opened. The nursery was dark. She was on her feet before she had finished thinking, moving barefoot across the cold floor toward the small bed where 5-year-old Prince Cassian slept. He was still there, curled beneath his blanket, breathing softly. She let out the breath she had been holding, but she did not relax. Something in the house was wrong tonight, and she had learned in her 3 years at Ashworth Manor never to ignore that feeling. She crossed to the window and looked down into the courtyard. A servant was sweeping up a shattered vase, muttering apologies to no one, and a footman stood nearby shaking his head. It was nothing. Only an accident. And yet Alara's pulse did not slow. She stayed by the window a moment longer, watching the shadows near the garden wall, before she finally returned to her chair beside Cassian's bed and sat down to wait out the rest of the night. This was her life now, and she did not resent it. She had come to Ashworth Manor with nothing but a letter of recommendation and a need to disappear from her old life, and the household had given her a purpose. She taught the young prince his letters and his numbers. She soothed him when he woke from nightmares about a mother he barely remembered. She was the one who noticed when his fever crept up in the night, the one who knew he was afraid of loud thunder and the color of a certain blue coat a stranger had once worn. Nobody else in the great house noticed these things. Nobody else had reason to. Below in the manor's grand hall, preparations were already underway for the biggest event Ashworth had seen in a generation. In 3 days, Duke Alaric Ashworth would announce his engagement before the entire court, and everyone from the scullery maids to the stable hands spoke of nothing else. His bride was Lady Seraphina Vale, a woman so admired that strangers wrote poems about her golden hair before they had even spoken to her. She had a laugh that filled rooms and a way of remembering the names of servants that made everyone adore her. The whole estate was swept up in her glow, certain that their duke had found perfection itself. Alara had seen Lady Seraphina only a handful of times, always from a distance, always in passing. She did not begrudge her the attention. It was simply not Alara's world. Governesses were not invited to admire brides-to-be up close. They existed in the corridors between rooms, the quiet spaces where important people did not look. Still, there was one moment, weeks earlier, that had stayed lodged in Alara's mind like a splinter she could not quite remove. She had been walking Cassian back from the garden when Lady Seraphina passed them on the stairs. The boy had smiled up at her, the way children smile at anyone beautiful and bright, and reached out his small hand in greeting. For half a second before she caught herself, Seraphina's face had twisted into something cold and sharp, something that did not belong on the face of a woman so celebrated for her warmth. Then it was gone, replaced instantly by a dazzling smile, and she had swept past them without another glance. Alara had told herself she imagined it. She told herself again now, sitting in the dark nursery with Cassian's steady breathing beside her. Tired eyes played tricks. Grief and long nights made a person see danger where there was none. She had learned that lesson too many times in her own past to trust her instincts completely. And yet, by morning, the manor was alive with movement. Silk ribbons in deep blue and gold were being strung along the grand staircase. The head housekeeper barked orders at a stream of maids carrying flowers larger than their own heads. In the kitchens, a small army of cooks argued over the correct thickness for a wedding cake that would not even be needed for months, since this was only the engagement celebration, not the wedding itself. Everyone wanted everything perfect for the moment when their duke would slide a ring onto Lady Seraphina's finger in front of the assembled nobility of the region. Cassian, thrilled by the chaos, tugged on Alara's sleeve as they made their way to the Eastern study for his morning lessons. "Will there be cake for me too?" he asked, his eyes wide with the particular hope only small children could summon over dessert. "I am sure there will be cake for everyone," Alara said, smoothing his unruly dark hair, so like his late mother's that it sometimes made her chest ache to look at him. "But first, your letters." He groaned the dramatic groan of a boy who found alphabets far less interesting than pastries, and Alara could not help but smile. These small, ordinary moments were what she treasured most in this enormous house full of secrets and silk and ambition. Cashin did not care about titles or fortunes. He cared about cake and stories, and whether the black cat in the stable had had her kittens yet. In his presence, Alara could almost forget the strange life she had left behind. The reason she had come to this manor under a different kind of quiet than most governesses carried with them. They had barely settled at the small wooden desk when a sharp knock came at the study door. It was Mr. Doyle, the Duke's steward, a tall and serious man who rarely visited the nursery wing unless something required urgent attention. "The Duke wishes to see the young master," Doyle announced, his eyes flicking briefly to Alara before returning to Cashin. "Lady Seraphina has requested his presence for a family portrait." Alara rose immediately, smoothing down her plain gray dress. "Of course, I'll bring him straight away." "That will not be necessary," Doyle said, not unkindly but with the firm tone of a man used to being obeyed. "Lady Seraphina asked that only the boy attend. The governess is not required." Cashin's small hand found Alara's before she could respond, gripping tight. "I want her to come too," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. Doyle's expression did not change. "The instructions were clear, young master." Alara knelt so she was eye level with the boy. "It's only a portrait," she said gently, though something in her stomach had gone tight and cold. "I'll be right here when you return, I promise." Cashin did not look convinced, but he was a well-mannered child, raised to understand that adults' instructions were rarely questioned. He let Doyle lead him from the room, glancing back once at Alara with wide, worried eyes before the door closed behind them. Alara stood alone in the study for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. It was such a small thing, a family portrait. Every noble household commissioned them, especially before grand announcements like the one 3 days away. There was nothing sinister about a woman wanting a proper image of the family she was about to join. And yet Alara found herself walking to the window that overlooked the garden path leading toward the portrait room, watching until she caught sight of Doyle and Cashin crossing the lawn. She watched until they disappeared from view, and only then did the tightness in her chest begin to ease, just slightly. She busied herself tidying the study, gathering scattered picture books and putting away the half-finished alphabet cards, trying to shake the unease that clung to her like damp air after rain. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself, as she often did, that her instincts had been sharpened too much by her past, that she saw threats in shadows that held nothing more than dust. An hour passed, then another. Cashin's lessons were normally never interrupted this long for a simple portrait sitting, and Alara found herself pacing the length of the study, glancing at the small clock on the mantel more often than she would admit to anyone. When the door finally opened again, it was not Doyle who brought Cashin back, but one of the younger maids, a girl named Bridget whose face was pale and pinched. "He's been asking for you," Bridget said quickly, before Alara could even ask a question. "He wouldn't stop crying during the sitting. Lady Seraphina was very displeased." Alara's stomach dropped. "Where is he now?" "In the small parlor. They said he needed to calm down before anyone else saw him upset." Bridget hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if checking she would not be overheard. "Miss Whitmore, I probably shouldn't say this, but I was passing by the portrait room earlier and I heard Lady Seraphina speaking to him. Her voice sounded different than I've ever heard it. Sharp, not like how she talks to everyone else." "Different how?" Bridget's eyes darted to the door again. "I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. It didn't sound kind is all I mean. And then the boy started crying right after." Alara did not wait to hear more. She hurried down the corridor toward the small parlor, her mind spinning through a dozen possibilities, none of which she liked. When she pushed open the door, she found Cashin curled in the corner of a settee, his small shoulders shaking with the aftershocks of tears already cried. He looked up when he heard her enter, and the relief that broke across his face nearly undid her composure entirely. "Alara," he choked out, scrambling off the settee and running to her. She caught him and knelt down, wrapping her arms around him as he buried his face in her shoulder. "I'm here," she murmured, stroking his hair. "I'm here now, you're safe." It took several minutes before his breathing evened out enough for words. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and confused. "She said I wasn't smiling right. She said if I kept crying, bad things happen to children who embarrass their family." Alara went very still. "Who said that, sweetheart?" "Lady Seraphina." Cashin sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand, a habit Alara had spent months trying gently to correct and had never once minded until this exact moment. She smiled the whole time so nobody else would notice, but her eyes weren't smiling. Her eyes looked like ice. A child's imagination could turn anything into something frightening. Alara knew this. She had comforted Cashin through nightmares about monsters under the bed and shadows in the hallway that were nothing more than curtains stirred by a draft. But there was something in the specific detail of his words, the exact phrasing of a threat too precise for a 5-year-old to invent on his own, that made the hair on the back of Alara's neck rise. "You did nothing wrong," she told him firmly, pulling back so she could look him directly in the eyes. "Do you understand me? Nothing at all. Sometimes grown-ups say unkind things, and it is never, ever the fault of the child who hears them." He nodded, though his lower lip still trembled. Alara held him a moment longer before helping him to his feet, and together they made their way back toward the nursery wing, away from the portrait room and its silk-draped chairs and painted backdrops of family harmony that did not, apparently, extend to moments no one else was meant to witness. That night, after Cashin had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Alara sat by candlelight in her small room adjoining the nursery, staring at nothing in particular. She thought of the flash of coldness she had seen on the staircase weeks ago. She thought of Bridget's pale, uncertain face. She thought of a small boy telling her, in a voice far too calm for the words he was saying, that a beautiful woman's eyes had looked like ice. She told herself one more time that she was building a storm out of scattered clouds. Lady Seraphina was adored by everyone who mattered. The entire region spoke of her kindness, her grace, her perfect suitability to become the next Duchess of Ashworth. It was not Alara's place to question any of it, not with her modest position and her own carefully buried past. And yet, before she blew out her candle, she reached for the small leather notebook she kept tucked beneath her mattress, the one she used to record Cashin's lessons and small milestones, and on a fresh page in careful handwriting, she wrote down the date, the time, and every detail Bridget and Cashin had told her. She did not yet know why she felt the need to keep such a record. She only knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that something beneath the golden surface of this engagement was not as perfect as everyone believed, and that no one else in the entire grand house was paying close enough attention to notice. Outside her window, the moon rose over Ashworth Manor, silvering the rooftops and the ribbons already strung for a celebration that was still 3 days away. Somewhere in the East Wing, Lady Seraphina Vale slept peacefully in a chamber fit for a future duchess, dreaming, perhaps, of the perfect life laid out before her. And in the small room beside the nursery, a forgotten governess closed her notebook, blew out her candle, and lay awake far longer than she should have, listening to every creak and whisper the old house made in the dark. The morning after the incident in the portrait room, Alara woke before dawn, as she always did, and found herself standing at the nursery window long before Cashin stirred. The estate below was already busy. Gardeners trimmed hedges into perfect shapes. Workers carried crates of imported flowers through the side gate. Everything moved with the precision of a household determined to present a flawless celebration to the world in 2 days' time. She watched Lady Seraphina cross the eastern lawn that morning, a vision in pale blue, laughing with 2 other noblewomen as though she carried not a single burden in the world. Servants bowed their heads as she passed. A young stable boy dropped the bucket he was carrying simply from the nervous excitement of being noticed by her, and she paused, laughed warmly, and helped him gather the spilled water with her own gloved hands before continuing on her way. The small crowd that witnessed it beamed with adoration. By midday, the story of her kindness to the stable boy had already spread through every corner of the manor. Alara found herself wondering how two such different pictures of the same woman could exist. The gracious, radiant Serafina everyone else saw, and the cold, sharp-eyed Serafina a frightened 5-year-old had described in a corner of the small parlor, tears still wet on his cheeks. She told herself again that children misunderstood things, that perhaps Serafina had simply grown impatient during a long and tedious sitting, said something short-tempered in a moment of stress, and Cashin's young mind had magnified it into something far darker than intended. It was possible. It was, Alara reasoned, even likely. But she kept her notebook close all the same. That afternoon, Cashin's lessons were interrupted again, though this time for a happier reason. The Duke himself, a broad-shouldered man with quiet gray eyes and a reputation for fairness that made him well-liked among his tenants, appeared in the study doorway unannounced. It was rare for Duke Alaric Ashworth to visit the nursery wing at all. His days were consumed by matters of the estate, correspondence with distant relatives, and now, of course, the endless demands of the coming celebration. "I heard there was some trouble yesterday," he said, his eyes moving briefly to Alara before settling on his nephew. He crouched down to the boy's level, an unusual gesture for a man of his standing. "Are you well, Cashin?" The boy nodded quickly, glancing at Alara as though checking whether he was allowed to speak freely. She gave him the smallest encouraging nod. "I didn't mean to cry," Cashin said in a small voice. "I know it embarrassed everyone." Something flickered across the Duke's face, too fast for Alara to name, but it looked almost like concern. "You embarrassed no one," he said firmly, echoing, without knowing it, the exact words Alara had used the night before. "A portrait can wait for another day when you feel more like smiling. There is no shame in tears, Cashin. Even dukes cry sometimes." The boy's face brightened slightly at that, and for a moment Alara allowed herself to feel a flicker of warmth toward this man she so rarely spoke with. Whatever else might be happening beneath the polished surface of this household, the Duke's affection for his nephew seemed genuine. He rose to his feet then, and for the first time in the 3 years Alara had lived under his roof, he addressed her directly. "Miss Whitmore, is it?" "Yes, Your Grace." She dropped into a small curtsy, caught off guard by the sudden attention. "My nephew speaks of you often. He tells me you taught him to read faster than any tutor his age has managed." A faint, almost surprised smile crossed his face. "I confess I did not know that until recently. Thank you for your care of him." "It is my honor, Your Grace," Alara replied, and meant it entirely, even as her mind raced with a dozen things she wished she had the standing to say. She wanted to tell him about the portrait room, about the ice in Serafina's eyes, about the strange, precise threat a small child had repeated in a trembling voice. But a governess did not question the character of a future duchess to the Duke himself, not without proof, not without risking her position, and more importantly, Cashin's trust that she would never make his private fears public without cause. The moment passed. The Duke offered his nephew one more warm word before excusing himself to attend to preparations for the engagement celebration, and the study fell quiet again, filled only with the scratch of Cashin's pencil against paper as he practiced his letters. That evening, restless and unable to settle, Alara took a longer route back from the kitchens after fetching Cashin's evening tea, one that wound past the eastern gallery instead of the direct servants' passage. She told herself it was simply a change of scenery. In truth, some instinct she could not quite name had drawn her that way. The gallery was mostly empty at that hour, lit only by a few flickering wall sconces, lined with portraits of Ashworth ancestors staring down with painted solemnity. She was nearly through it when she heard voices coming from the small sitting room just beyond, its door left slightly ajar. She recognized Lady Serafina's voice immediately, though it carried none of the warmth the entire estate had come to associate with her. "And if the arrangements are not finished by the appointed time, there will be consequences you will not enjoy," Serafina was saying, her tone low and clipped. "I did not come this far to be delayed by your incompetence." A man's voice responded, muffled and difficult to make out, something apologetic and placating. "I don't care about your excuses," Serafina snapped. "Everything must be in place before the celebration, every single detail. The boy is the only obstacle left, and once he is dealt with, there will be nothing standing between me and the title I have worked years to secure. Alara's blood turned to ice in her veins. She froze mid-step in the shadow of the gallery, barely daring to breathe, straining to hear more. "And the Duke?" the man's voice asked, slightly clearer now, though still too soft to place. "The Duke will grieve as any uncle would," Serafina said, and there was something in her voice now, something almost amused, that made Alara's stomach twist violently. "And then, in time, he will be comforted, by me, as he always was meant to be." Footsteps shifted inside the room, moving toward the door. Alara did not wait to hear anything further. She turned and hurried back the way she had come, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the walls, Cashin's forgotten tea tray rattling faintly in her shaking hands. She did not stop moving until she reached the nursery wing, until she had set down the tray, checked on the sleeping boy in his bed, and locked the connecting door between his room and the corridor, something she had never once felt the need to do before that night. Only then did she allow herself to sit, to breathe, to process what she had just overheard. The boy is the only obstacle left. Words that could mean 100 things, she told herself desperately. Business obstacles, legal obstacles. Perhaps Cashin's presence complicated some matter of inheritance that had nothing to do with harm at all. But the tone, the chilling ease in Serafina's voice as she spoke of grief and comfort and things dealt with, it did not sound like a woman discussing paperwork. It sounded like a woman discussing something far darker, something Alara did not have the courage to name even in the privacy of her own mind. She thought of going to the Duke immediately, of demanding an audience no matter how improper and telling him everything she had heard. But what proof did she have? A muffled conversation glimpsed through a half-open door, words that could be twisted a dozen innocent ways by a woman as beloved and persuasive as Serafina Vale. Alara was a governess. Serafina was days away from becoming Duchess. If she accused the wrong person and was wrong, she would lose everything, including her place beside the only child who had ever truly needed her. And if she was right and did nothing, the consequences did not bear thinking about. She spent the rest of that night sitting in the chair beside Cashin's bed, just as she had the night before, watching him sleep, listening to every sound the old house made. Every creak of settling wood became a footstep in her mind. Every distant voice became a whispered threat. By the time dawn broke gray and pale over the estate, she had made her decision. She could not go to the Duke without proof, but she could watch. She could listen. She could do what she had always done best in this grand house full of people too important to notice her. Remain quiet, remain unseen, and pay attention to every single detail that everyone else was too dazzled to see. In her notebook that morning, beneath the entry from 2 nights before, she wrote a new line in careful, deliberate handwriting. "The boy is the only obstacle left." She underlined it twice, closed the notebook, and tucked it back beneath her mattress with hands that had finally stopped shaking. 2 days remained until the engagement celebration. 2 days to uncover the truth hiding beneath the golden surface of Ashworth Manor, before whatever Serafina Vale had planned came to pass. Alara did not know yet what she was searching for, or how she would find it, or what she would do if her worst fears proved true. She knew only that Cashin trusted her, that his safety mattered more than her own comfort or position, and that she would not fail him, no matter what it cost her. Outside, the household continued its joyful preparations, oblivious to the danger gathering quietly in its shadows. Ribbons were hung, flowers arranged, silver polished until it gleamed. And somewhere within those same walls, a forgotten governess began, carefully and silently, to search for the truth no one else was looking for. The next morning brought a strange stillness to Alara, the kind that comes after fear has been sitting in the chest so long it starts to feel almost familiar. She dressed Cashin, fed him his porridge, and walked him through his lessons with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, all while her mind turned over the conversation she had overheard the night before. "The boy is the only obstacle left." She heard the words again and again, in that same cold, amused voice, no matter how hard she tried to focus on the letters traced across the page in front of her. She needed proof, not whispers overheard in a dim gallery, not the frightened words of a 5-year-old that could be dismissed as imagination, but something solid enough to bring before the Duke without risking her position, or worse, without risking being dismissed from the manor entirely and losing any chance of protecting Cassian at all. That afternoon, while Cassian napped under the watchful eye of Bridget, Elara made her way to the household's small records room, a modest space tucked behind the main study where correspondence, invoices, and guest lists for the celebration were kept. She had a simple excuse ready if anyone questioned her presence there, something about verifying the schedule for the children invited to the celebration, since several noble families were bringing their own young sons and daughters. It was thin, but it was enough to explain her being somewhere she rarely had reason to visit. The room was empty when she arrived, lit by a single tall window and smelling faintly of ink and old paper. She moved carefully, scanning the neatly labeled folders and ledgers stacked along the shelves, unsure exactly what she was even looking for. Evidence, she told herself. Anything that might explain who the man in the gallery had been, or what arrangements Serafina had been so insistent on completing before the celebration. Her eyes fell on a ledger near the back, slightly out of place among the others, its spine newer than the rest. She pulled it free and opened it carefully. Inside were lists of payments, small sums sent to names she did not recognize, dated over the past several weeks. Most were labeled simply as household expenses or catering arrangements, unremarkable on their own. But one entry, dated just 3 days earlier, caught her attention immediately. A payment larger than the others, made to a name she did not recognize, Heir. Listed beside it, in handwriting she now recognized from having glimpsed Serafina's correspondence once before, was a single word: transport. Transport of what, the ledger did not say. Elara copied the name and the date carefully into her own notebook, her hands steady now with purpose rather than fear, and returned the ledger exactly as she had found it. She had barely stepped back from the shelf when she heard footsteps approaching the door, and she turned quickly, pulling a random folder from the nearest shelf and pretending to study its contents just as the door opened. It was Mr. Doyle, the steward, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of her standing among the household records. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "this is an unusual place to find you. I was checking the guest list for the young visitors expected at the celebration," she said, keeping her voice light and unbothered, holding up the folder in her hands as though it contained exactly what she claimed. "I wanted to be certain Cassian would have companions his own age among the festivities." Doyle studied her a moment longer than felt comfortable, though Elara held his gaze without flinching. Finally, he nodded, though something in his expression remained guarded. "See that you finish quickly. This room is not typically open to the nursery staff." "Of course. My apologies for the intrusion." She replaced the folder and left the room with measured, unhurried steps, though her heart did not slow until she was well down the corridor and out of Doyle's sight. That name, Heir, stayed with her for the rest of the day, turning over and over in her mind like a stone she could not stop touching. She did not recognize it from any of the household staff, nor from any of the noble families she had heard mentioned in preparation for the celebration. It was, she suspected, exactly the kind of name a person hired for something they did not wish attached to their own reputation. She considered, briefly and painfully, confiding in someone. Bridget, perhaps, who had already shown her a measure of trust by sharing what she had overheard in the portrait room. But the risk was too great. If word reached the wrong ears that a governess was quietly investigating the future Duchess of Ashworth on the eve of her engagement celebration, Elara would be dismissed before she ever had the chance to protect Cassian at all. Worse, if Serafina learned of it, there was no telling what she might do to silence the threat before it could grow. So Elara continued as she always had, quiet, watchful, careful. She spent the following day, the last full day before the celebration, moving through her ordinary duties while paying closer attention than ever to the small details of the household around her. She noticed the way certain servants avoided the eastern gallery after dusk. as though some unspoken understanding had spread among the staff that Lady Seraphina preferred privacy in that wing during the evening hours. She noticed a covered carriage arriving at the servants' entrance late in the afternoon, unloading crates that were carried directly into a storage room usually reserved for garden equipment, a room that was, curiously, locked immediately afterward by a man Ilara did not recognize among the regular household staff. She noticed, too, the way Seraphina's public warmth never wavered, not once, even as the celebration drew closer and the pressure of 100 small arrangements mounted around her. She smiled at every servant. She complimented every flower arrangement. She charmed every visiting relative who arrived early for the festivities, until the entire household spoke of nothing but how fortunate the Duke was to have found such a woman. Only Cassian, it seemed, had glimpsed what lay beneath that smile, and only Ilara believed him. That evening, after Cassian had been settled for bed, Ilara found herself once again drawn toward the eastern gallery, though this time she moved with far greater caution, staying close to the walls, avoiding the pools of candlelight that might reveal her presence. She told herself she was not looking for trouble. She told herself she simply needed to understand, needed one more piece of the puzzle before she dared bring anything to the Duke. The small sitting room where she had overheard the conversation 2 nights before was dark and empty this time, its door closed. But as she passed the narrow servants' passage that ran behind it, she heard voices again, this time coming from further along, near the locked storage room she had noticed earlier that day. She pressed herself into the shadow of a doorway and listened. "Everything is in place for tomorrow night," said a man's voice, rough and unfamiliar, likely the same one she had heard before, though clearer now in the quiet of the empty passage. "The boy's window latch has been loosened just as you asked. It will look like an accident." A curious child wandering too close to an open window in the middle of the celebration, with everyone too distracted by the festivities to notice, until it is too late. Ilara's blood turned to ice. She pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. "Good," Seraphina's voice replied, cool and satisfied. "The celebration will provide the perfect distraction. Every eye in that ballroom will be on me and the Duke when the ring is presented. No one will think to check on a sleeping child until the damage is done. And if someone does notice him missing before then—" "They won't," Seraphina said, an edge of impatience creeping into her voice. "The governess will be occupied helping prepare the other children invited to the celebration. I have already arranged it with Doyle. She will have no reason to check on him until well after the ring is on my finger and the toasts have begun." Ilara's mind raced, piecing together the horrifying shape of what she had just heard. This was no vague business obstacle, no matter of inheritance or paperwork. This was a plan, carefully constructed, to ensure that Cassian would be alone and unwatched during the very celebration meant to secure Seraphina's future as Duchess. A loosened window latch, a room built to look like a tragic accident, a grieving Duke who would, in time, be comforted, exactly as Seraphina had promised 2 nights before. She did not wait to hear more. She turned and fled back down the passage, her footsteps as light and silent as she could manage despite the roaring panic in her ears, not stopping until she reached the safety of the nursery wing and the locked door that separated Cassian's bed from the rest of the great, glittering, treacherous house. She sat beside his bed that night, watching him sleep, her mind spinning through every possible course of action. She could go to the Duke immediately tonight and tell him everything. But what if he did not believe her? What if her word, a governess against his radiant, celebrated bride-to-be, was simply not enough, and Seraphina learned of the accusation before the celebration even began? There would be no second chance to protect Cassian if her warning came too soon, and gave Seraphina the opportunity to alter her plan into something even harder to stop. She thought of confronting Seraphina directly, of making clear that her scheme had been overheard, that someone was watching. But that path felt even more dangerous. A woman capable of arranging what Ilara had just heard was not a woman who would simply abandon her plans because a governess had discovered them. If anything, such a confrontation might only accelerate whatever Seraphina intended, might make Cashin's safety even more precarious than it already was. No. Alara needed proof that could not be argued away, proof strong enough to convince the Duke in a single conversation, delivered at exactly the right moment, before the celebration began and Serafina's plan could unfold unchecked. She needed to see the loosened window latch with her own eyes. She needed to know precisely what Serafina and her hired accomplice intended, down to every detail, so that when she finally spoke, there would be no room for doubt. Tomorrow was the celebration. Tomorrow night, according to the voices she had overheard, was when the danger would come. She had less than a full day left to prepare, to gather what proof she could, and to find some way to protect the boy sleeping peacefully beside her without revealing her hand too soon. She reached beneath her mattress and pulled out her notebook one final time that night, recording everything she had heard in careful, precise detail. The loosened latch, the timing of the plan, Doyle's unwitting arrangement to keep her occupied during the crucial hours of the celebration. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, not from fear alone now, but from a fierce and steady resolve that had begun to settle over her exhaustion like armor. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever risk it demanded of her, Alara Whitmore had already decided. She would not let anyone bring harm to this child, not while she still had breath in her body to stop it. Let the entire estate cheer for its golden bride-to-be. Let every noble guest arriving tomorrow believe they were witnessing the union of two perfect, deserving people. Alara knew the truth now, the truth hidden beneath silk and smiles and carefully rehearsed warmth, and she would not let that truth remain buried, no matter what it cost her to bring it into the light. She closed her notebook, tucked it away, and finally allowed herself a few hours of restless sleep, knowing that when morning came, the most important day of her quiet, careful life would already be underway, whether she felt ready for it or not. The day of the celebration arrived wrapped in sunlight and music, and by the time evening fell, Ashworth Manor had transformed into something out of a storybook. Candles glowed in every window. Musicians tuned their instruments in the grand ballroom, and carriages bearing noble families from across the region rolled steadily up the long drive, spilling out guests dressed in silk and jewels. Laughter and music drifted through the halls, and everywhere Alara looked, she saw servants rushing with trays of food, footmen bowing before arriving guests, and the entire household caught up in a single glittering current of celebration. She had spent the morning exactly as Serafina intended, occupied with the young guests invited to the festivities, helping settle a handful of children from visiting noble families into a supervised playroom, where they would spend the early part of the evening before being brought out briefly to witness the engagement announcement. It was, Alara realized grimly, precisely the arrangement she had overheard the night before, designed to keep her attention divided and far from Cashin's side during the hours that mattered most. She had managed, through careful insistence and a small, believable excuse about the prince needing rest before his public appearance, to have Cashin settled in his own nursery rather than among the visiting children, at least for the earliest part of the evening. It was a small victory, but not enough. She knew that once the formal presentation began, once every eye in the ballroom turned toward the Duke and his radiant bride-to-be, she would be expected to help manage the other children, and Cashin would be left alone in his room, exactly as planned. Before that moment came, she needed to see the window latch with her own eyes. She slipped away from the playroom during a brief lull, telling the young nursemaid assisting her that she needed to check on Cashin before the formal proceedings began. It was not entirely a lie. She hurried through the corridors, weaving past servants carrying trays and guests already beginning to gather near the ballroom entrance, until she reached the nursery wing. Cashin was awake, dressed in a small formal jacket for his brief appearance later that evening, sitting quietly by the window with a picture book he was not truly reading. He looked up when she entered, his face brightening instantly. "Ilara." "Look, I'm not crying today," he said proudly, holding up the book as though it were proof of good behavior. "I can see that," she said, crossing the room and kneeling beside him, glancing quickly toward the window latch as she did. Her breath caught. There, exactly as the voice in the passage had described, the metal latch that should have held the window firmly shut showed the faintest signs of tampering, a small gap where it did not sit quite flush against the frame, easy to overlook unless one already knew to look for it. Her heart pounded as she reached out and tested it gently. It gave far too easily beneath her fingers, swinging loose with almost no resistance at all. A curious child, leaning against it in the dark, might tumble straight through without any struggle whatsoever, and no one would think to question a tragic accident during a night when the entire household's attention was fixed elsewhere. She fixed the latch as best she could in the moment, jamming it firmly closed, though she knew it would not withstand deliberate tampering a second time if someone returned to loosen it again. She needed a better solution, and she needed it quickly, before the celebration reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. "Cassian," she said carefully, turning back to the boy, "I need you to do something very important for me tonight. Can you be very brave and very clever, just for a little while?" He nodded solemnly, sensing the seriousness in her voice even if he did not understand its cause. "After your appearance at the celebration, I want you to come straight back here with Bridget, not with anyone else. Do you understand? Only with me or with Bridget and no one else, not even if they say I sent them." "Not even Lady Seraphina?" he asked, his small brow furrowing. "Especially not Lady Seraphina," Alara said, and though she tried to keep her voice gentle, something in her tone must have carried the weight of her fear, because Cassian's eyes widened with sudden understanding beyond his years. "Is she going to hurt me?" he whispered. Alara's chest tightened painfully at the question, at the terrible, precise clarity of a child sensing danger that adults around him refused to see. She could not lie to him, not entirely, not when his safety depended on his own caution now more than ever. "I am not going to let anyone hurt you," she said fiercely, taking his small hands in hers. "I promise you that with everything I am, but I need your help to keep you safe tonight. Can you do that for me?" He nodded again, more firmly this time, and something in the set of his small jaw reminded her, briefly and painfully, that he carried royal blood in his veins, blood that had weathered far greater dangers than a single treacherous night. She found Bridget shortly after, pulling her aside in a quiet corner of the servants' passage, and speaking as quickly and clearly as she dared without revealing the full truth of what she had discovered. She told Bridget only that she feared for Cassian's safety that night, that something felt terribly wrong, and that she needed her help to ensure the boy was never left alone, not for a single moment, until Alara herself could return to his side. Bridget, to her credit, did not ask too many questions. She had seen enough of the household's strange currents over the past week to trust Alara's instincts without demanding full explanation. The formal presentation began not long after, and Alara found herself standing at the edge of the grand ballroom among a cluster of servants and household staff, watching as the Duke led Lady Seraphina to the center of the room beneath a canopy of candlelight and imported flowers. The assembled guests fell into a hush of anticipation. Seraphina had never looked more radiant, dressed in pale silver silk that caught the candlelight with every small movement, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that made her look, quite literally, as though she belonged in a painting. The Duke spoke a few brief, warm words about his admiration for her, about the future they intended to build together, and the room erupted into applause as he slid a ring onto her finger. Seraphina's face lit with an expression of perfect joy, tears glistening in her eyes as she embraced him, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath in collective delight at witnessing something so beautiful. Alara watched from the shadows near the edge of the room, her stomach twisted into knots, knowing that somewhere beneath that radiant performance lay a woman capable of arranging a child's death and calling it an accident. Cassian was brought forward briefly, as planned, to stand beside his uncle and offer a small formal bow to the assembled guests, a moment that drew warm laughter and applause for his solemn, careful effort. Alara watched him closely from across the room, her entire body tense with the effort of appearing calm. The moment his brief appearance concluded, she caught Bridget's eye across the crowd and gave the smallest possible nod. Bridget moved quickly, gathering Cashin gently by the hand and leading him from the ballroom before anyone could suggest otherwise, murmuring something about the young prince needing his rest after such an exciting evening. Elara watched them disappear through the far doorway and allowed herself the briefest moment of relief. It did not last. She was pulled aside almost immediately by one of the senior housekeepers, informed in a firm, unquestionable tone that several of the visiting children had grown restless in the playroom and required immediate attention, since their parents were occupied enjoying the celebration and could not be disturbed. Elara had no choice but to comply, hurrying toward the playroom even as every instinct in her screamed to follow Cashin instead. It took nearly half an hour to settle the visiting children, calming a dispute over toys, soothing a young girl who had grown tired and tearful, coaxing a reluctant boy into finally agreeing to sleep. By the time she was finally able to slip away, the celebration in the ballroom below had reached its peak, music and laughter rising through the halls in a joyful roar that seemed to swallow every other sound in the house. She hurried toward the nursery wing, her heart pounding with a dread she could not quite name, and found Bridget standing outside Cashin's door, her face white with panic. "He's gone," Bridget said before Elara could even ask. "I only stepped away for a moment, I swear it, just to fetch him some water, and when I came back," her voice cracked. "The window was open, Miss Whitmore. The latch, it was just hanging there, and he's gone." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Elara's feet. She pushed past Bridget into the nursery, her eyes flying to the window she had jammed shut with her own hands only hours before. It hung open now, the latch clearly forced, the night air pouring into the empty room where a small boy should have been sleeping safely. "How long?" Elara demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "How long were you gone?" "Only a few minutes, I promise, I only." Elara was already moving, her mind racing through every terrible possibility, every word she had overheard in that dark servant's passage. "The boy's window latch has been loosened, just as you asked. It will look like an accident. Someone had returned. Someone had undone her work, had taken advantage of the single unguarded moment Bridget had stepped away, and now Cashin was gone from his room while the entire household celebrated below, utterly unaware that anything at all was wrong. She had no time left for careful plans, for gathering proof, for waiting until the perfect moment to bring her suspicions before the Duke. Every second that passed now was a second that mattered more than her own position, her own safety, her own carefully guarded secrets from a past she had spent years trying to leave behind. "Find Mr. Doyle," Elara said to Bridget, her voice steady now despite the terror pounding through her veins, steadied by the sheer necessity of the moment. "Tell him the prince is missing. Tell him to alert the guards immediately and to say nothing to Lady Seraphina. Do you understand me? Nothing to Lady Seraphina, no matter what anyone tells you." Bridget nodded, tears streaming down her face, and ran. Elara turned back to the open window, gripping the sill with both hands, staring out into the dark garden below where shadows stretched long and impenetrable beneath a rising moon. Somewhere out there, in the vast grounds of Ashworth Manor, a frightened little boy had been taken from his bed while the entire household celebrated below, utterly blind to the danger unfolding in their midst. She did not wait for guards. She did not wait for permission. Elara Whitmore climbed through the window into the cold night air, her thin slippers sinking into the damp grass below, and began to run. The garden at night looked nothing like the bright, orderly space Elara knew from daylight walks with Cashin. Every hedge cast a long, twisted shadow, every path seemed to fork into two more uncertain than the last, and the distant music and laughter from the ballroom felt like it belonged to another world entirely, one that had no idea a child was missing from its midst. Elara stood for a moment beneath the open nursery window, forcing herself to breathe, to think, rather than simply run blindly into the dark. She knew this garden better than most, better perhaps than anyone else in the household besides the head gardener himself, because she and Cashin had spent countless afternoons wandering its paths together, discovering every hidden corner, every secret bench tucked behind rose bushes, every gap in the hedge just wide enough for a small boy to squeeze through when playing hide and seek. If someone had taken him through this window, they would have needed a route away from the house that avoided the main paths, avoided the lit areas where a guard or wandering guest might notice a struggling child. Her eyes fell on the servants' path that ran along the eastern wall, mostly hidden by overgrown hedges and rarely used except by staff moving between the kitchens and the storage buildings. It was the same direction, she realized with a jolt, as the locked storage room she had noticed the day before, the one that had received a mysterious delivery of crates late in the afternoon. She ran toward it, her slippers soaked through with dew, her breath coming in ragged gasps that she fought to keep quiet. The path narrowed as it wound past the kitchen garden, and there, in the soft earth near a break in the hedge, she spotted something that made her heart stop entirely. A small, unmistakable footprint, far too small to belong to any adult, pressed deep into the mud as though the child who made it had been moving quickly, perhaps dragged or carried in haste. Beside it, larger footprints, a man's boots deep and heavy, moving in the same direction. Alara followed the trail as quickly as she dared, staying low and close to the hedges, grateful now for every quiet, watchful habit she had built over 3 years of being overlooked in this grand house. She had learned, without ever intending to, how to move unseen through Ashworth Manor, and that skill, born of simply never mattering enough for anyone to notice, might now be the very thing that saved Cashin's life. The trail led her toward the old storage building near the edge of the estate grounds, a low stone structure once used for equipment and now largely abandoned, except for the occasional overflow of garden tools. It was the same building, she realized, connected to the storage room inside the manor by a servant's passage, the one where crates had been delivered and locked away the day before. A faint light flickered from a gap beneath the storage building's door. Alara crept closer, pressing herself against the cold stone wall beside a narrow window, and peered carefully inside. Her breath caught in her throat. Cashin sat on an overturned crate in the center of the room, his small hands bound loosely in front of him, tears streaking silently down his face though he made no sound, as though some instinct had told him that silence was safer than crying out. Standing over him was a broad, rough-looking man she did not recognize, likely the one whose voice she had heard twice now in the shadowed passages of the manor. He was speaking in low, impatient tones to someone else, a second man near the door, both of them glancing frequently toward a small pocket watch, clearly waiting for some appointed hour. "She said midnight," the man near the door was saying. "Not a moment before, not a moment after. The whole household needs to still be caught up in the celebration when it's done." "Midnight's still an hour off," the first man grumbled, casting an irritated glance toward Cashin. "Boy won't stop sniveling, makes this whole business feel worse than it needs to." "Feelings don't matter. Payment does. Garrick's waiting on the rest of his coin, and we don't get paid until this is finished proper, made to look like the accident she wants it to look like." Garrick Hale, the name from the ledger, confirmed now in the mouth of the very man standing before her. Alara pressed her hand hard against the cold stone wall to steady herself, forcing her breathing into something quiet and controlled despite the roaring panic in her chest. An hour. She had perhaps an hour before whatever accident they intended to stage would be carried out, an hour to somehow free Cashin and bring proof of this entire scheme before the Duke, all without alerting Serafina that her plan had already unraveled. She could not overpower 2 grown men alone. She was no fighter, no soldier, only a governess with quick wits and quiet feet, and she knew with painful clarity that a direct confrontation would end badly for both herself and Cashin. She needed help, and she needed it quickly, but she could not risk leaving Cashin alone in that building for the time it would take to run back to the manor and return with guards. She thought of Bridget, sent to find Doyle. She thought of the steward's stern, unreadable face and hoped desperately that Bridget had reached him, that he had believed her, that guards were even now searching the grounds. But she could not simply wait and hope. Every minute mattered. Her eyes swept the small building's exterior, searching for any advantage, any tool, any opportunity. She spotted, near the base of the wall, a narrow drainage grate half-covered with overgrown grass, likely leading to some old cellar space beneath the storage building that had fallen out of use. If there was an old cellar, there might be another entrance, one the two men guarding Cashin did not know to watch. She circled the building carefully, staying low, until she found what she was looking for. A narrow, half-collapsed door set low into the stone foundation on the building's far side, mostly hidden behind a tangle of ivy, clearly forgotten by whoever had last used this structure for storage. It took several agonizing minutes of careful, silent effort to pull enough of the ivy aside and pry the old door open just enough to slip through, her heart hammering the entire time at the thought of a creaking hinge giving away her presence. The passage inside was dark and narrow, smelling of damp earth and disuse, but it led, just as she had hoped, toward a set of old stone steps rising up into what she guessed must be a storage cellar directly beneath the room where Cashin was being held. She climbed carefully, testing each step for stability, until she reached a low wooden trapdoor set into the ceiling above her, faint light and muffled voices seeping through the cracks around its edges. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened. The two men were still speaking above her, their voices closer now, still discussing the timing of their plan, still waiting for the appointed hour. Alara's mind raced. She could not simply burst through the trapdoor and expect to free Cashin without being caught immediately by two grown men standing directly above her. She needed a distraction, something that would draw both men away from Cashin's side, even for a moment, long enough for her to reach him and get him to safety through the passage she had just discovered. Her eyes fell on a small pile of old garden tools abandoned in the corner of the cellar, and among them, a rusted lantern, its glass cracked but its small reservoir of oil still intact. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in her mind. If she could create the impression of movement, of discovery, somewhere else on the grounds, she might draw the men's attention away from the building entirely. She made her way back out through the narrow, ivy-covered door, circling wide around the building's far side. And there, in the moonlight, she spotted exactly what she needed. The old well near the edge of the kitchen garden, its stone rim overgrown with moss, rarely visited except by the gardeners who maintained the property's older features. She gathered a handful of loose stones, and working her way as close to the storage building as she dared without being seen through its windows, she began throwing them, one after another, toward the well and the surrounding brush, creating a series of soft, scattered impacts that might, to two nervous men expecting trouble, sound very much like someone moving carefully through the darkness nearby. It worked more quickly than she dared hope. She heard voices rise sharply inside the storage building, heard the door creak open, heard heavy footsteps moving out into the night to investigate the sound. She did not wait to see how long the distraction would hold. She sprinted back toward the hidden passage, slipped through the narrow, ivy-covered door once more, and climbed the stone steps as quickly as her trembling legs would carry her. The trapdoor gave way more easily than she expected, and she pushed through into the small storage room to find Cashin alone, exactly as she had hoped, his eyes widening with a mixture of terror and disbelieving relief as he recognized her. "Alara," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Quiet," she murmured, rushing to his side and working quickly at the rope binding his small wrists, her fingers clumsy with urgency but determined. "We don't have much time. Can you walk?" He nodded, and she pulled him to his feet, guiding him quickly toward the trapdoor even as she heard voices outside beginning to return. The two men's search of the darkness apparently coming up empty, and their patience wearing thin. "Down here," she whispered, lowering Cashin through the trapdoor opening and into the narrow passage below, following close behind him and pulling the trapdoor shut as quietly as she could manage just as she heard the storage building's main door creak open once more. They moved through the narrow cellar passage in near total darkness, Alara keeping one hand firmly on Cashin's shoulder to guide him, her other hand tracing the damp stone wall to keep them oriented toward the ivy-covered exit. Behind them, muffled through the trapdoor and the thick stone walls, she heard raised voices, sharp and alarmed, as the two men discovered their captive missing. "Faster," she urged Cashin softly, half carrying him now as they reached the narrow door and pushed through into the cold night air once more. She did not look back toward the storage building. She simply ran, Cashin clutched tightly against her side, back toward the distant glow of the manor's windows and the sound of music still drifting faintly from the celebration within, utterly unaware of the danger that had just unfolded so close to its walls. They had not gone far before she heard it. Shouts behind them, closer than she had hoped, the two men clearly having discovered the low door and realized how their captive had escaped. Heavy footsteps crashed through the underbrush somewhere behind them in the darkness, and Alara's lungs burned with the effort of running while carrying Cashin's weight against her side, the manor's lights still frustratingly distant. "Alara," Cashin gasped, his small voice trembling. "They're coming." "I know," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the terror clawing at her chest. "We're almost there, just a little further." She angled their path toward the eastern gallery entrance, the closest door into the manor from this side of the grounds, praying it would be unlocked at this hour with the celebration still underway and staff moving in and out to manage the festivities. The footsteps behind them grew louder, closer, and Alara did not dare look back to see how much distance remained between them and their pursuers. The gallery door loomed ahead, and beyond it, warm light and the distant sound of music, safety so close she could almost taste it. She pushed forward with the last of her strength, Cashin's small hand gripped tightly in hers, and reached for the door handle just as a rough voice shouted from somewhere terrifyingly close behind them in the dark. The gallery door burst open beneath Alara's hand, and warm light spilled out over the dark grass just as heavy footsteps closed the distance behind them. She shoved Cashin through the doorway ahead of her, spinning around in time to see one of the men, the broader one who had guarded the storage room, lunging out of the shadows with an arm outstretched to grab at her sleeve. She twisted away sharply, pulling the heavy gallery door shut behind her with all her strength, and heard it slam just as the man's hand struck the wood instead of her arm. She threw the old iron bolt across the frame with trembling fingers, and the door shuddered once beneath a furious blow from the other side before falling still, the man apparently unwilling to risk drawing attention by forcing his way through a locked door, in full view of the celebration, lights glowing from every window nearby. Alara sagged against the door for only a moment, her chest heaving, before turning to Cashin, checking him over with frantic hands for any injury she might have missed in the chaos of their escape. He was shaking, tear tracks dried on his cheeks, but whole and unharmed, and the sight of him standing there, alive and safe, nearly broke the careful composure she had held together through every terrifying minute of the last hour. "We need to find your uncle," she said, her voice rough but steady, taking his small hand firmly in hers. "Right now, can you be brave just a little longer?" He nodded, and together they hurried through the gallery, past startled servants who stared at the disheveled governess and the young prince appearing suddenly from the direction of the garden, both of them covered in dirt and grass stains, Cashin's wrists still marked with faint red lines from the rope that had bound them. They found Doyle first, near the entrance to the ballroom, his face a mask of controlled alarm as he spotted them approaching. "Miss Whitmore, thank heavens, I received Bridget's message and I've had guards searching the grounds. We couldn't find any sign of—" He stopped short as his eyes fell on Cashin's bound wrists and the state of both their clothing. "What happened?" "There is no time to explain everything," Alara said urgently. "I need to speak with the Duke immediately. It cannot wait, Mr. Doyle. Lives may depend on it." Whatever skepticism the steward might have shown her under ordinary circumstances evaporated at the sight before him. He nodded sharply and led them through a side passage into the ballroom, weaving quickly past clusters of guests still caught up in the joyful celebration, the music and laughter feeling almost obscene now against the memory of what Alara had just witnessed in the storage building beyond the garden. They found the Duke near the center of the room, still receiving congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers, Lady Seraphina at his side, radiant and smiling, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a picture of perfect devotion. Alara's stomach turned at the sight of her, at the effortless warmth she projected even now, even after everything that had just unfolded in the darkness beyond the manor's walls. The Duke's expression shifted the moment he caught sight of his nephew, his easy smile vanishing instantly as he took in the boy's disheveled state, the marks on his small wrists, the fear still visible in his wide eyes. "Cassian," he said sharply, moving quickly to kneel before the boy, ignoring the surprised murmurs rippling through the nearby guests. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Your Grace," Alara said before Cassian could speak, her voice carrying more strength than she felt, "I must speak with you privately, immediately. It concerns your nephew's safety." The Duke's gray eyes flicked up to meet hers, sharp and assessing, and whatever he saw in her face must have convinced him of the seriousness of her words, because he rose at once, lifting Cassian into his arms despite the boy being nearly too large for such an embrace, and turned toward a side chamber just off the main ballroom, gesturing for Alara and Doyle to follow. "Alaric, darling, what is happening?" Seraphina's voice followed them, laced with perfectly calibrated concern, and Alara felt every muscle in her body tense at the sound of it. "Stay here, my dear. I will return shortly," the Duke said over his shoulder, and Alara caught, for just a fraction of a second, the flash of something cold and calculating cross Seraphina's beautiful face before she smoothed it once more into an expression of gentle worry. Inside the small side chamber, away from the music and the eyes of curious guests, the Duke set Cassian down gently on a cushioned bench and turned to Alara, his expression grave. "Explain, all of it, now." Alara did not hesitate. She told him everything, from the flash of coldness she had witnessed on the staircase weeks before, to the frightened words Cassian had spoken after the portrait sitting, to the conversation she had overheard in the Eastern Gallery 2 nights ago, and the second conversation the following night that had revealed the exact plan to loosen Cassian's window latch and stage his disappearance as a tragic accident during the celebration. She described the name she had found in the household ledger, Garrick Hale, and the payment marked simply as transport. She described finding Cassian bound and guarded in the old storage building, the two men discussing payment and timing, waiting for the appointed hour of midnight to carry out whatever final step their plan required. Throughout her account, the Duke's face grew increasingly pale, his jaw tightening with a fury Alara had never seen from the normally composed and gentle man. Doyle, standing silently near the door, looked equally shaken, clearly recalling now the very arrangement he had unwittingly helped orchestrate, the one that had kept Alara occupied with visiting children during the crucial hours of the celebration. "You heard this with your own ears," the Duke said finally, his voice tight and controlled in the way of a man holding back an overwhelming urge to shout. "Lady Seraphina arranging for Cassian's death disguised as an accident. Yes, your Grace, I would swear it before any court, any authority you name. And there are still 2 men on the grounds who can confirm every word of it, if they have not already fled following our escape." The Duke turned to Doyle immediately. "Gather the guards, every one of them. I want the grounds searched thoroughly, and I want those 2 men found and held for questioning, whatever it takes." His voice hardened further. "And send word quietly to the magistrate. This will require proper legal handling, but I want it moving before the night is through." Doyle nodded and hurried from the room, and for a moment only the Duke, Alara, and Cassian remained in the small chamber, the boy curled quietly against the cushions, watching the adults around him with wide, exhausted eyes. "Why did you not come to me sooner?" the Duke asked, turning back to Alara, his voice edged with something that was not quite anger but carried a similar weight. "2 nights ago, you say you overheard enough to suspect this. Why did you wait?" Alara met his gaze steadily, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. "Because I had no proof beyond overheard words, your Grace, and I feared that if I accused Lady Seraphina without certainty, and I was wrong, I would lose my place at Cassian's side entirely, with no one left to watch over him at all. And if I was right and she learned her plan had been discovered too early, I feared she might simply alter her methods rather than abandon them, making the danger to Cassian even harder to prevent." She paused. "I was trying to protect him in the only way available to someone in my position. I understand if that decision seems inadequate to you now." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting slowly in his expression, the anger softening into something closer to reluctant respect. "You climbed through a window in the middle of the night, alone, and tracked 2 grown men holding my nephew captive, and freed him yourself, rather than waiting for guards who might have arrived too late." "I did what needed to be done, Your Grace. There was no time to wait for anyone else." Before the Duke could respond further, the chamber door opened, and Serafina swept in, her expression a masterful blend of concern and gentle confusion. "Alaric, I couldn't simply wait outside any longer. Everyone is asking what's happened, and I—" Her eyes fell on Alara, standing disheveled and dirt-streaked beside the Duke, and something flickered behind her carefully composed features, gone almost too quickly to catch. "What is the governess doing here?" "She is here," the Duke said, his voice deadly quiet now, "because she just told me an extraordinary story, Serafina, about a plan to loosen my nephew's window latch, about 2 men paid to make his death look like an accident during tonight's celebration, while every eye in this house was fixed on you and me." He paused, watching her closely. "About a name. Heir." Whatever composure Serafina had built over years of careful performance cracked, just for a moment, just long enough for Alara to see the truth flash raw and unguarded across her beautiful face before she forced it back beneath a mask of wounded confusion. "Alaric, surely you cannot believe such a wild accusation from a servant who—" "She found him," the Duke interrupted sharply, gesturing toward Cashin, still curled quietly on the bench, his small wrists marked with rope burns visible for anyone to see. "Bound in the old storage building, guarded by 2 men waiting for midnight. Explain that to me, Serafina, if you can." For the first time since Alara had known her, Lady Serafina Vale had no immediate, gracious answer ready. Her eyes darted briefly toward the door, toward some avenue of escape, before settling back on the Duke with a final, desperate attempt at composure. "I don't know what you think you understand," she said, her voice trembling now, though Alara could not tell if it was genuine fear finally surfacing or simply another performance. "But I would never harm that child, Alaric. You must believe me. Whatever this governess has told you is—" "I believe her," the Duke said simply, and the words seemed to land in the room with the weight of a door closing forever. "I believe every word." Serafina's mask shattered entirely then, the warmth and grace draining from her face all at once, replaced by something colder and sharper, the very expression Cashin had described weeks before, the one only a frightened child had been brave enough to name for what it truly was. "You have no idea what you're throwing away," she said, her voice suddenly low and venomous, all pretense of gentleness abandoned. "Do you have any idea how carefully I built this? How many years I spent making myself exactly what this family needed, exactly what everyone wanted to see? And you would throw it all away for a governess and a child who was never even truly yours." "He is my family," the Duke said, his voice hard as stone. "That was never a question you should have needed answered." The chamber door opened again, and this time it was Doyle along with 2 armed guards, their expressions grim. "Your Grace, the 2 men were found attempting to flee through the eastern gate. They're being held now, and one of them has already begun to talk, hoping for leniency. He's confirmed everything, Your Grace, every word." Serafina's face went utterly white. "Take her," the Duke said quietly, though his voice carried through the small chamber like a thunderclap. "She is to be held under guard until the magistrate arrives to hear the full account of what has happened tonight." The guards moved forward, and Serafina's composure broke entirely, dissolving into a torrent of protests and accusations that fell on ears no longer willing to believe her carefully constructed innocence. Alara watched, exhausted and hollow, as the woman the entire estate had celebrated only hours before was led from the room, her golden reputation crumbling apart with every furious word she spat back toward the Duke. When the chamber finally fell quiet again, the Duke turned back to Alara, his expression shifting from cold fury to something far gentler, something that looked almost like wonder as he studied the woman who had spent 3 years unnoticed in the corners of his household and had, in the space of a single terrifying night, saved his nephew's life through nothing but her own quiet courage and careful attention. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "I owe you a debt I do not know how to begin repaying." Alara, suddenly aware of how thoroughly exhaustion had settled into every part of her body, managed only a small, tired smile. "Your Grace, I only ask that Cashin be kept safe, and that I be allowed to remain at his side. That is all the repayment I require." The Duke's gaze softened further, something new and thoughtful entering his expression as he looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the very first time since she had entered his household 3 years before. "That," he said quietly, "I believe I can arrange." The celebration below continued for a while longer, the musicians unaware that anything had changed, the guests still laughing and toasting a future that had already collapsed behind closed doors. Doyle moved quietly among the household staff, arranging for the festivities to wind down gradually rather than abruptly, avoiding the kind of panic that might spread through the assembled nobility if word of the night's true events reached them too soon. The official explanation, for now, was simple exhaustion on the part of the newly engaged couple, a story thin enough to raise a few eyebrows but not thin enough to invite immediate scandal. Alara carried Cashin back to the nursery herself, refusing the offer of a servant to relieve her of the task, unwilling to let him out of her sight for even the length of a corridor after everything that had happened. He had fallen into an exhausted, fitful sleep against her shoulder by the time they reached his room, and she laid him carefully in his bed, checking the window latch twice, then a third time, before finally allowing herself to sit in the chair beside him once more, just as she had every night since her suspicions first began. She did not expect to sleep, and she did not. Sometime near dawn, a soft knock came at the nursery door, and she opened it to find the Duke standing there, still dressed in his formal attire from the celebration, though it was rumpled now and his gray eyes carried the heavy weight of a sleepless night. "May I sit with him a while?" he asked quietly. "I find I cannot yet return to my own chambers without seeing for myself that he is safe." She stepped aside to let him in, and for a long while they sat together in silence on either side of the sleeping boy's bed, the first gray light of morning beginning to creep through the curtains. "The magistrate arrived an hour ago," the Duke said finally, his voice low. "He has taken statements from both men who held Cashin and from Seraphina herself, though she offers little beyond denial and accusation at this point. The one called Garrick Hale, however, has been found and detained as well. It seems he was hired months ago, long before the engagement was even publicly announced, suggesting this plan was in motion far longer than any of us realized." Alara's stomach turned at the thought. Months of careful planning, hidden beneath a courtship the entire region had celebrated as the union of two perfect people. How long had she been planning this? "The magistrate believes since before I ever proposed," the Duke said grimly. "It seems Seraphina's family fortune was not nearly as secure as she led everyone to believe. Marriage to me would have restored it, certainly, but only fully if Cashin were removed from any possible claim to the estate, since as my closest living relative, he stands to inherit a significant portion regardless of any children Seraphina and I might have together in the future. With him gone, and myself grieving and vulnerable, she calculated that whatever remained of the inheritance would eventually fall entirely under her influence. She built an entire courtship, an entire public reputation, around a plan to harm a child," Alara said quietly, still struggling to reconcile the warm, celebrated woman the household had adored with the cold calculation the Duke now described. "She built her entire life around performances, it seems," the Duke said, something bitter entering his voice. "I confess I do not know how I failed to see it. 3 years she courted my attention, 3 years I believed her warmth was genuine, and I never once suspected the truth hiding beneath it." He paused, glancing toward Alara with an expression she could not quite name. "And yet you, who spent far less time in her presence than I did, saw through her within weeks." "I did not see through her," Alara admitted. "Not at first. I saw one moment, one flash of something wrong, and I nearly convinced myself I had imagined it. It was Cashin who truly understood first." Children often see things adults have learned to overlook. The Duke's gaze moved to his sleeping nephew, and something tender crossed his features. I owe him more attention than I have given these past years. I have been so consumed by the business of the estate, by the expectations of my title, that I fear I left too much of his care to others, however capable those others proved to be. You are here now, Alara said gently. That matters more than any amount of guilt over the past. He looked at her then, a long, searching look that made her suddenly aware of her own disheveled appearance, the dirt still clinging to the hem of her dress, her hair loosened from its careful pins during the night's chaos. You risked your life for him, he said quietly. Climbed through a window in the dark, tracked armed men through the grounds alone, freed him with nothing but your own courage and quick thinking. Any trained guard in my household would think twice before attempting what you managed without hesitation. I did not think of it as a choice, Your Grace, Alara said simply. He needed help, and I was the only one positioned to give it in time. There was no decision to make. That, the Duke said softly, is precisely what troubles me most about how little this household has valued you until now. Before she could respond, a soft knock at the door interrupted them, and Doyle appeared, his expression grave. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but the magistrate requests your presence. There has been a development. The Duke rose immediately, though he paused at the door to glance back at Alara once more. Stay with him. I will send word of what has happened. Alara nodded, and he left, and she settled back into her chair beside Cassian, watching the boy sleep as the morning light grew steadily brighter through the curtains. The development, when word finally arrived nearly an hour later, sent a fresh wave of alarm through the household. Serafina, held under guard in a chamber in the eastern wing, had attempted to bribe one of the young guards assigned to watch her, offering him a substantial sum of jewelry hidden within her belongings if he would allow her a brief window of escape before the magistrate's formal proceedings began. The guard, to his credit, had refused and immediately reported the attempt, but it revealed with stark clarity that Serafina had no intention of accepting the consequences of her actions quietly. Additional guards were posted, and the chamber's single window was secured with iron bars normally reserved for more serious confinement, an indignity that would have seemed unthinkable only a day before for a woman the entire region had celebrated as the future Duchess of Ashworth. Cassian woke shortly after midday, groggy and disoriented, and Alara spent the following hours simply sitting with him, answering his careful, hesitant questions as gently as she could, reassuring him again and again that he was safe now, that Lady Serafina could not reach him, that the men who had frightened him were held securely and would face proper justice for what they had done. He clung to her more tightly than usual throughout the day, flinching at sudden sounds, and Alara understood that whatever physical danger had passed, the fear of that night would linger with him for some time yet. The Duke visited twice more that day, each time bringing news of the unfolding investigation. Garrick Hale, it emerged, had a history of similar arrangements across the region, hired discreetly by desperate or ambitious clients for tasks too dangerous or dishonorable to handle themselves. He offered his full cooperation to the magistrate in exchange for leniency, providing detailed records of his correspondence with Serafina stretching back several months, correspondence that left no remaining doubt about the extent and premeditation of her plan. By evening, the full shape of Serafina Vale's scheme had been laid bare before the magistrate, the Duke, and a small circle of trusted household officials. She had arrived at Ashworth Manor over a year earlier as a struggling noblewoman whose family fortune had quietly collapsed under mounting debts, a fact carefully hidden behind expensive gowns borrowed against future promises, and a carefully cultivated public image of effortless grace. Her courtship of the Duke had been, from its very beginning, a calculated campaign to secure not merely his affection, but his entire fortune, with Cassian's existence as the sole remaining obstacle to full and unquestioned control of that wealth. I confess, the Duke said to Alara that evening, once Cassian had finally drifted into peaceful sleep, and the two of them stood together near the nursery window, watching the last of the celebration's decorations being quietly taken down across the darkened grounds below. I feel a fool for not recognizing what should have been obvious. 3 years I let this household believe her warmth was genuine, let myself believe it most of all. You are not a fool for trusting a woman who dedicated years of careful effort to appearing trustworthy, Alara said gently. That is not foolishness. That is simply the nature of deception well practiced. The fault lies entirely with her, your grace, not with anyone who believed the performance she worked so hard to create. He was quiet for a long moment, studying the darkened grounds below, before turning to look at her directly. You spoke similar words to Cassian, the night after the portrait sitting, that he had done nothing wrong, that unkindness from others was never the fault of the one who suffered it. Alara felt a flush rise to her cheeks, surprised he had known of that private moment at all. You heard of that. Bridget mentioned it in passing, while explaining the events of the past week to the magistrate, the Duke said, a faint, tired smile touching his features for the first time since the crisis had begun. It seems you have offered wisdom to more members of this household than merely my nephew, Miss Whitmore, whether you intended it or not. The formal proceedings, the Duke explained, would take several more days to complete properly, given the seriousness of the charges and the need for thorough documentation before matters could be brought fully before the regional authorities. Serafina would remain under secure confinement throughout, and word of the scandal, despite every effort to manage it quietly, had already begun to spread through the wider household staff and would inevitably reach the broader nobility of the region before long. The engagement will be publicly and formally dissolved, of course, the Duke said. And the truth will need to be told, at least in part, to prevent wild speculation from filling the silence with something even worse than what actually occurred. I confess, I do not relish the prospect of that conversation with the wider court, but it is necessary, and I would rather the truth be known plainly than allow rumor to distort it into something unrecognizable. Alara nodded, understanding the weight such a public reckoning would carry for a man of his standing. The humiliation of having been so thoroughly deceived by someone he had intended to marry, laid bare before the very society whose good opinion mattered so greatly to a household like his. For what it is worth, she said quietly, I do not believe anyone who hears the full truth will think less of you for having been deceived. I believe they will think a great deal more of you for how swiftly and decisively you acted once the truth came to light. The Duke studied her for a long moment in the dim light of the nursery, something warm and unfamiliar settling into his tired features. You have a remarkable gift, Miss Whitmore, for offering exactly the words a person needs to hear in their most difficult moments. I find myself wondering how such a gift went so entirely unnoticed by this household for so long. Governesses are rarely noticed for anything beyond their charge's progress in letters and numbers, Your Grace, Alara said, though there was no bitterness in the observation, only simple, weary truth. It is the nature of the position. Perhaps, the Duke said slowly, it is a nature that deserves reconsideration. He did not elaborate further that evening, and Alara did not press him to, too exhausted from the sleepless night and the emotional weight of everything that had unfolded to give the comment more thought than passing curiosity. But as she settled once more into the chair beside Cassian's bed for what she hoped would finally be a peaceful night's rest, she found the Duke's words returning to her mind, unbidden, long after he had bid her a quiet good night, and returned to his own chambers to face the long, difficult days of reckoning still ahead. The days that followed brought a slow, careful unraveling of the life Ashworth Manor had built around its golden bride-to-be. The magistrate's formal investigation concluded within the week, supported by Garrick Hale's detailed testimony, the confessions of the 2 men who had held Cassian captive, and a stack of correspondence recovered from Serafina's private chambers that left no remaining doubt about the extent of her planning. She was to face trial before the regional court, charged with conspiracy against the life of a royal ward, a crime severe enough that even her once considerable charm could not soften the consequences awaiting her. Word of the scandal spread through the nobility exactly as the Duke had feared it would, carried on the same eager tongues that had once praised Seraphina's grace and warmth. Ilara watched from her quiet corner of the household as the story transformed, day by day, from stunned disbelief into something closer to collective horror, as more details emerged about the depth and coldness of the deception that had nearly cost a child his life. The Duke bore the public reckoning with a dignity that only deepened the respect his tenants and peers already held for him. He did not attempt to hide from the scandal, nor did he seek to minimize his own role in having been so thoroughly deceived. He spoke plainly, when required, before the assembled regional court, describing the events of that terrible night with a steadiness that left little room for the wilder rumors already circulating to take firmer hold. Cashin, too, was called upon to give a brief account of what he remembered, a prospect that filled Ilara with dread on the boy's behalf. But the magistrate, sensitive to the tender age of the witness, allowed the questioning to take place in a private chamber rather than the full formal court, with Ilara seated beside him the entire time, her hand steady in his as he answered each careful question with a bravery that brought quiet tears to the eyes of more than one hardened official in the room. "You did wonderfully," Ilara told him afterward, holding him close as they walked back toward the carriage that would return them to the manor. "Will she come back?" Cashin asked quietly, his small voice carrying the particular fear of a child who had learned, far too young, that the people meant to protect him could sometimes become the very source of danger instead. "No," Ilara said firmly, "she will never come near you again. I promise you that with everything I am." The trial concluded within the month, swifter than such proceedings often moved, aided considerably by the overwhelming weight of evidence against her. Seraphina Vale was found guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous harm to a minor under royal protection, a verdict that stripped her of whatever remained of her family's fading noble standing, and sentenced her to a lengthy period of confinement far from Ashworth Manor, and everyone she had once so carefully charmed. She left the courtroom in silence, her golden hair dulled and her once radiant face hollow with the particular bitterness of a schemer whose careful performance had finally, completely, collapsed. Ilara did not attend the sentencing, choosing instead to remain at the manor with Cashin, sparing him the sight of the woman who had once nearly taken his life. She learned of the verdict only through Doyle's brief, matter-of-fact report that evening, delivered with the quiet satisfaction of a man relieved to see justice properly served. With the trial concluded and the immediate danger fully resolved, life at Ashworth Manor slowly began settling back into something resembling its former rhythms, though not entirely unchanged. Cashin's nightmares persisted for some weeks, and Ilara spent many nights in the chair beside his bed, soothing him back to sleep with quiet stories and gentle reassurances, never once complaining of the toll it took on her own rest. Gradually, the nightmares grew less frequent, and the boy's easy laughter, so central to his character before the crisis, began returning in fuller measure with each passing week. The Duke, too, seemed changed by the ordeal, though in ways Ilara found herself watching with quiet, growing interest. He visited the nursery far more often than he ever had before, no longer content to leave his nephew's care entirely to others, while he attended to the endless demands of his title. He learned, slowly and somewhat clumsily at first, the small details of Cashin's daily life that Ilara had always understood instinctively. His particular fear of loud thunder, his love of stories about brave knights, his stubborn insistence on choosing his own clothes each morning, even when the choices did not always match. "I find I have missed a great deal of him these past years," the Duke admitted to Ilara one afternoon, as they sat together in the garden watching Cashin chase a small orange cat that had recently taken up residence near the stables. "I told myself the demands of the estate required my full attention, that his care was well handled by capable staff, and I did not need to trouble myself further. I see now how much of that was simply an excuse to avoid the harder work of truly knowing him." "You are doing that work now," Ilara said. "That matters a great deal, Your Grace. Children forgive absence far more readily than they forgive continued indifference, once someone finally chooses to show up for them properly." The Duke glanced at her, something thoughtful in his expression. "You speak as though from experience." Alara hesitated, surprised by how easily the observation had slipped from her, and how close it came to truths she had spent years keeping carefully guarded. "I had my own childhood, Your Grace, before I came to service. It taught me a great deal about the difference between people who are present and people who merely provide." He did not press her further, though something in his gaze suggested he understood there was more to her story than she had yet shared, and that he would welcome hearing it in time, should she ever choose to offer it. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew steadily more frequent, no longer confined to brief exchanges about Cashin's well-being, but expanding into longer discussions during quiet afternoons in the garden or evenings after the boy had been put to bed. Alara found herself, to her own quiet astonishment, looking forward to these moments with an eagerness she had not expected and was not entirely certain how to name. The Duke, for his part, began seeking her opinion on matters well beyond the nursery, asking her thoughts on household decisions, on tenant concerns, on the slow rebuilding of trust within a staff still shaken by the scandal that had so nearly touched them all. "You see this household more clearly than anyone else within it," he told her one evening, as they walked together along the eastern gallery, the same corridor where she had once overheard the conversation that changed everything. "I find myself valuing your perspective more with each passing week. I have simply had a great deal of practice watching quietly from the edges of rooms, Your Grace," Alara said, a faint smile touching her lips. "It is, perhaps, the one true skill this position has given me." "A skill that saved my nephew's life," he reminded her gently. "I do not think you give yourself nearly enough credit for what you accomplished that night, Miss Whitmore. Nor, I confess, for everything you have quietly given this family in the years since you arrived, long before any of us thought to properly notice it." They had reached the small alcove near the end of the gallery, the same spot where Alara had once frozen in the shadows, straining to hear a conversation that would upend the entire household. The Duke stopped there, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes serious in the fading evening light. "I have been considering," he said slowly, "how very little this household valued you, until circumstances forced everyone to see clearly what had been true all along. I find that troubles me greatly, Miss Whitmore, and I would very much like to correct it, if you would allow me to." Alara's heart quickened, though she kept her voice carefully steady. "Your Grace, I require no correction. I am content in my position, caring for Cashin. That has always been enough for me." "And if I told you," the Duke said, taking a careful step closer, "that I have come to want more from you than simply your care of my nephew, however invaluable that care remains. That these past weeks, watching you move through this household with a quiet courage and steady wisdom I have rarely encountered in anyone, of any station, I have found myself thinking of you far more often than propriety alone would suggest is wise." Alara felt her breath catch, uncertain, for one of the very few times in her carefully guarded life, of how to respond. "Your Grace, I am a governess. Whatever regard you may feel, the difference in our stations remains. A difference I find myself caring about far less than I once might have," he interrupted gently. "I nearly bound myself to a woman whose entire character was performance, built on nothing true beneath its beautiful surface. And I very nearly lost my nephew to that same performance, saved only by the quiet, genuine courage of a woman this household never thought to properly see. I have had a great deal of time these past weeks to consider what truly matters in a person meant to stand beside me, Miss Whitmore, and I find that station matters a great deal less than character, once a person has witnessed character as remarkable as yours." Alara stood very still, the weight of his words settling slowly over her, uncertain whether to trust the sudden warmth blooming in her chest after so many years of careful, deliberate invisibility. "I do not know what to say, Your Grace." "Say nothing yet if you are not ready," he said gently. "I do not ask for an answer tonight, nor do I wish to press you before you are certain of your own feelings. I ask only that you allow me the chance to earn your regard properly, in time, without the pressures of grand celebrations or public performance that so poisoned my judgment before. Simply time, Miss Whitmore. That is all I ask. Alara found, standing there in the fading light of the gallery where so much fear and danger had once passed, that she wanted very much to give him exactly that. The weeks that followed brought a quiet, careful courtship, unlike anything Ashworth Manor had witnessed before, free of the grand gestures and public performances that had characterized the Duke's engagement to Seraphina. Instead, there were slow afternoon walks through the garden, quiet conversations over tea after Cassian had been settled for the evening, small thoughtful gestures that spoke of genuine attention rather than calculated charm. The Duke learned, gradually and with evident sincerity, the details of Alara's own guarded past, the reasons she had come to service seeking a quiet, unremarkable life far from whatever difficulties had shaped her earlier years, and he offered no judgment, only steady, patient understanding. Cassian, delighted beyond measure to see his two favorite people growing closer, made no secret of his approval, often appearing at inconvenient moments during their quiet conversations to offer enthusiastic and entirely unsubtle encouragement that left both adults laughing despite themselves. 6 months after the terrible night that had nearly cost the young prince's life, Ashworth Manor once again filled with preparations for a celebration, though this one carried none of the hollow, performed grandeur of the first. When Duke Alaric Ashworth announced his engagement to Alara Whitmore before a smaller, more intimate gathering of trusted friends and family, the joy that filled the room was unmistakably genuine, reflected in every face present, from the household staff who had watched Alara's quiet courage save their young prince, to Cassian himself, who stood proudly beside his uncle throughout the entire announcement, beaming as though the moment belonged as much to him as to either of the two people being celebrated. The forgotten governess who had once moved unseen through the grand corridors of Ashworth Manor stood now at its very center, not because she had ever sought such a position, but because her quiet devotion to a frightened child had revealed a character too remarkable, in the end, for anyone to continue overlooking. And as she looked around the room at the family she had never expected to find, at the small boy who called her his best friend, and at the man who had finally learned to see her fully, Alara understood that every quiet, unnoticed year that had come before had simply been preparing her for exactly this moment, when courage and truth had finally been given the chance to be seen. Not every shadow from that terrible night, however, had been fully accounted for. Nearly a year after Seraphina's trial, word reached Ashworth Manor that Garrick Hale, the man whose hired hands had once bound Cassian in that cold storage building, had escaped during a transfer between holding facilities, slipping away into the countryside under cover of a stormy night. The news arrived by urgent courier just 3 days before Alara and Alaric's wedding was set to take place, throwing the household into a fresh current of anxious tension no one had expected to face again. The Duke doubled the guard around the manor immediately, stationing men at every gate and along the garden walls, and Alara found herself once more sleeping lightly, listening for footsteps in the dark, though this time she was not alone in her vigilance. Alaric insisted on personally checking every lock and latch himself each evening, a habit born of the same fierce protectiveness that had grown steadily between them since the night his nephew had nearly been taken from him. Cassian, now 6 and considerably braver than the frightened boy who had once wept in a small parlor, sensed the tension in the household despite everyone's careful efforts to shield him from it. "Is it him?" he asked Alara quietly one evening, his voice steady in a way that spoke to how much he had grown since that terrifying night. "The man who tied my hands." Alara considered lying to spare him worry, then decided, as she always had, that honesty delivered with care served him better than comforting falsehoods. "He has escaped from where he was being held," she admitted. "But there are guards everywhere now, watching every path to this house, and he would be a fool to come anywhere near here again." "I'm not scared," Cassian said, lifting his chin with the particular determination of a child trying very hard to believe his own bravado. "You saved me once. You'd do it again." "I would," Alara said firmly, pulling him into a hug, "but I am hoping very much that I won't need to." 2 nights before the wedding, her hopes were tested. Ilara woke suddenly near midnight to the sound of a dog barking sharply somewhere near the stables, followed almost immediately by a shout from one of the perimeter guards. She was out of bed and moving before she had fully processed the sound, years of instinct honed during that first terrifying night, guiding her feet toward Cassion's room without conscious thought. She found Alaric already there ahead of her, having heard the same commotion from his own chambers, standing protectively near his nephew's bed with a lit candle in one hand. "Stay with him," he said quickly. "I need to see what has happened." "Not alone, you don't," Ilara said, and something in her tone must have convinced him there was no point arguing, because he simply nodded and allowed her to follow as they moved together toward the source of the disturbance, leaving Cassion in the capable care of Bridget, now a senior member of the nursery staff and fiercely protective of the boy in her own right. They found the guards clustered near the stable yard, torches raised, surrounding a figure who had been caught attempting to slip through a gap in the perimeter wall under cover of darkness. As they drew closer, Ilara's stomach twisted with grim recognition at the sight of the man's face, gaunt and desperate in the torchlight, his once rough confidence replaced by the hunted look of a man who had spent months running from justice. Garrick Hale had come back, driven, it seemed, by a desperate need for money that had led him to consider one final, reckless attempt, perhaps hoping to extract payment from a duke he believed might pay handsomely to keep the entire ordeal quietly buried before the wedding, or perhaps hoping for something darker still. Whatever his exact intentions, the guards had caught him before he ever came close enough to the manor itself to act on them, and he was quickly subdued and bound, his desperate protests of innocence falling on ears that had heard quite enough of his excuses during the trial many months before. "You will answer for this properly this time," Alaric said coldly, standing over the captured man with a fury Ilara had rarely seen from him. "There will be no further escapes." Hale was transported under heavy guard the following morning to a far more secure facility, one from which escape would prove considerably more difficult, and formal word arrived within the week confirming that additional charges had been added to his existing sentence, extending his confinement well beyond what he had originally faced. Whatever lingering danger his freedom had posed to the household was, at last, fully and permanently resolved. The wedding proceeded as planned, delayed by only a single day to allow the household's nerves to settle after the excitement of Hale's capture. It was, by every account, a celebration far removed from the golden, hollow spectacle that had once surrounded Seraphina's engagement. The guests who gathered were fewer in number but far warmer in spirit, drawn not by curiosity toward a beautiful stranger, but by genuine affection for a governess whose quiet courage had become the stuff of local legend throughout the region. Cassion stood proudly at the front of the small gathering, dressed in his finest jacket, beaming with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy as he watched the two people he loved most in the world exchange their vows beneath a canopy of simple white flowers in the very garden where he had once played, and on one terrible night had once been taken. Reclaiming that space for joy rather than fear felt, to Ilara, like its own quiet victory, separate from but woven into everything else the day represented. In the years that followed, Ashworth Manor settled into a new rhythm of genuine warmth that stood in sharp contrast to the anxious perfection it had once performed for the sake of appearances. Ilara continued, even after becoming Duchess, to spend her mornings in the nursery wing, though now she oversaw the education not only of Cassion, who grew into a thoughtful and courageous young man, but eventually of two more children born to her and Alaric in the years that followed, both of whom grew up hearing, in careful and age-appropriate detail, the story of the night their mother had climbed through a window in the dark to save their older brother's life. The household staff who had once overlooked the quiet governess in the corners of the great house now spoke of her with unmistakable pride, telling newer servants the story of that terrible night as something close to legend, a reminder that true worth was rarely found in the loudest, most celebrated performances, but often in the quiet, steady courage of those the world too easily forgot to notice. Alaric, for his part, never again allowed the demands of his title to distance him from the people who mattered most within his household. He remained, throughout his years as Duke, deeply involved in Cassion's upbringing and in the lives of his own children, determined never to repeat the mistake of mistaking a person's careful surface for the truth of their character, a lesson that had nearly cost him everything he held most dear. And Alara, who had once believed herself destined to remain forever unseen, a quiet presence in the margins of a grand and glittering world that had no place for her, found instead that her steady, unglamorous devotion had been the very thing that mattered most all along. She had never sought recognition, never wanted the title or the position that eventually came to her. She had wanted only to keep a frightened child safe, to do the quiet, careful work that no one else had thought to notice. And in doing so, she had built a life richer and truer than any golden performance could have ever offered. The estate that had once cheered so loudly for a perfect bride who had turned out to be nothing but a beautiful lie came, in time, to understand a far deeper truth. That real worth rarely announces itself with grand celebration, but reveals itself instead in the quiet, unwavering courage of those willing to act when it matters most, whether or not anyone is watching.